Who owns the world's debt? Every country on earth is in debt. The United States now owes over $38 trillion, the highest figure in its history. The European Union carries around $14 trillion. Japan holds nearly $9 trillion. Even oil-rich nations like Saudi Arabia and export powerhouses like Germany and China owe enormous sums. But here's the paradox that nobody wants you to think about too carefully. If everybody owes money, who exactly is owed? Welcome to Empire Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. This isn't a rhetorical puzzle. It's the question that exposes how the modern world actually works. Because when you follow the chain of creditors far enough, when you trace who owns what, all the way to the end, you discover something deeply unsettling. The world doesn't owe money to anyone in particular. It owes it to itself. But that comforting phrase, "we owe it to ourselves," is one of the greatest lies in modern economics. Because while the debt might be circular, the benefits flow in one direction, upward. Debt isn't just a burden nations carry. It's the architecture of modern power. Every war, every crisis, every boom and bust sits on top of this invisible scaffolding of IOUs. And the people collecting interest on those IOUs aren't we. They're a very specific they. Institutions, funds, and individuals whose names you mostly don't know, operating through mechanisms you're not supposed to understand. To understand how we reached this point, a planet drowning in over $315 trillion of total debt, nearly 3 times the size of the global economy, we need to go back to the beginning. Because debt wasn't always the foundation of everything. There was a time before this system existed, and understanding how it was built reveals who it was built to benefit. Centuries before the first credit card swipe or digital transfer, the idea of national debt was born not in Wall Street, but on a battlefield. In 1694, England was fighting France and running out of gold. Wars were expensive, and King William III had a problem. His treasury was empty, his people were taxed to the breaking point, and the French weren't going to wait for him to figure it out. The traditional options were exhausted. He couldn't conquer new territory fast enough to plunder it. He couldn't debase the currency any further without triggering revolt. He couldn't squeeze more taxes from a population already on the edge of starvation. Every previous king in this situation had simply lost the war. But William tried something different. He made a deal with a group of wealthy merchants. The terms were simple and revolutionary. Lend me money now, and I'll pay you interest forever. Not pay you back, pay you interest. A permanent stream of payments, backed not by gold in a vault, but by future taxes. Taxes that hadn't been collected yet. Wealth extracted from people who hadn't even been born. To manage this arrangement, the Bank of England was created. And with that creation, everything changed. For the first time in history, the state could spend money it didn't yet have. The government could make promises today based on the labor of citizens tomorrow, next year, next century. And the lenders, the merchants who put up the initial capital, received something more valuable than gold. A guaranteed perpetual income stream backed by the power of the state to tax its population forever. Think about what this meant in practice. A wealthy merchant could lend the king £1,000. Instead of getting his £1,000 back, eventually he got £50 a year. Every year, forever. And if he died, his children inherited that income stream. And their children. And theirs. A one-time investment became eternal rent on the productivity of an entire nation. These promises could be traded, bought, and sold, like any other asset. That was the birth of the government bond. That was the seed from which the entire modern financial system grew. And it was, from the very beginning, a mechanism for extracting wealth from the many to benefit the few. France watched what England accomplished and copied the model. The Netherlands refined it, integrating government bonds with their stock exchange, creating the first market where these promises could be bought and sold like commodities. When the American colonies declared independence, they had no gold, no established government, no tax base. But they had something else, the ability to promise future payment. Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary, understood this completely. He restructured America's Revolutionary War bonds, many of which had been trading at 20 cents on the dollar because people doubted America would survive, and made the federal government guarantee them at full value. This made early bondholders immensely wealthy overnight. It also established a crucial principle: American government debt was sacred. It would always be honored, always be paid, no matter what. This guarantee made US bonds valuable, which made future borrowing easier, which gave the young nation power far beyond what its size suggested. Hamilton didn't just save American credit. He created a class of wealthy creditors who had a vested interest in the federal government's survival. The bondholders became the most reliable supporters of strong federal power because their fortunes depended on it. Debt created political alignment. The people who owned government bonds became the people who shaped government policy. The logic of empire shifted fundamentally. Nations stopped conquering territory primarily to extract gold and silver in the moment. They started issuing bonds to extract interest payments forever. The battlefield became the balance sheet. War was no longer funded through plunder, it was funded through promises that would be paid by generations not yet born. And the beauty of the system, from the creditor's perspective, was that the people making the promises weren't the same people who'd pay them. Kings and presidents borrowed, peasants and workers repaid. This system accelerated dramatically in the 20th century. World War I saw every major power issue debt on an unprecedented scale. Britain borrowed so heavily to fight Germany that it spent the next 50 years making payments to American banks. France borrowed from Britain and America. Germany borrowed from everyone, then was forced to borrow more to pay reparations after losing. The entire post-war global order was built on debt relationships established during 4 years of industrial slaughter. World War II exploded those numbers even further. The United States alone issued hundreds of billions in war bonds. Buy bonds, back our boys, the propaganda posters urged. American citizens lent their savings to the government to fund the war machine. And after victory, instead of paying those bonds off, the government rolled them over into peacetime spending. The debt became permanent. It normalized peacetime borrowing as standard practice. Then came the moment when money itself became debt, when the last connection to physical reality was severed. In 1971, Richard Nixon ended the gold standard. Until that moment, the dollar, and by extension, much of the world's currency, was theoretically backed by gold. The US government promised that $35 could be exchanged for 1 ounce of gold. Foreign governments could, in principle, demand gold for their dollars. Then France actually tried to do it. In the late 1962, Charles de Gaulle grew suspicious of American monetary policy. He sent French ships to New York to collect gold for France's dollar holdings. Other countries watched and started making similar demands. The US faced a problem. It had printed far more dollars than it had gold to back them. If every country demanded gold, America would run out. So Nixon simply ended the promise. No more gold backing. From that point forward, the dollar was backed by nothing except confidence in the US government. And since global trade was conducted in dollars, every other currency became backed by confidence in confidence. Money became pure belief. Debt became fully untethered from any physical commodity. It floated free, anchored only by collective faith. The people who understood what this meant, the central bankers, the institutional investors, the financial engineers, realized they could create wealth out of nothing as long as everyone kept believing. The constraint was no longer how much gold do we have, but how much borrowing can we convince people to accept? And the answer, it turned out, was far more than anyone imagined. By the late 20th century, debt had become the world's dominant export. Countries didn't just borrow for wars or emergencies anymore. They borrowed constantly, routinely, for everything. Infrastructure, social programs, tax cuts, stimulus, bailouts, all financed through debt. And the question of who owns it all became both more complex and more important than ever. Let's start with the United States, because American debt isn't just national, it's the foundation of the global financial system. Out of $38 trillion in total debt, About half is publicly held, meaning owed to investors rather than to other government agencies. And here's where the scam becomes visible. Roughly 2/3 of those investors are American institutions: banks, pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, and the Federal Reserve itself, the central bank that's supposedly independent but is really just another arm of the same system. The Fed owns over $5 trillion in US government debt. Think about what that means. The government borrowed money from the central bank, which created that money out of nothing, and now the government owes it back with interest. It's the financial equivalent of writing yourself an IOU and then paying yourself interest on it. Except the interest comes from taxpayers, but it gets more intricate. The Federal Reserve is technically not a government agency, it's a private institution owned by member banks. When the Fed earns interest on government bonds, it distributes profits to these banks. So the chain goes, government borrows from Fed creates money from nothing, government pays interest using tax revenue, Fed distributes profits to private banks, taxpayer money flows through the government to the central bank, to private banks. It's wealth extraction dressed up as monetary policy. The remaining third of publicly held US debt, about $9 trillion, sits in foreign hands. Japan holds the most, roughly $1 trillion. Why would Japan lend so much to America? Because Japan runs massive trade surpluses with the US. Americans buy Japanese cars, electronics, machinery. Japan accumulates dollars from these sales. What do you do with $1 trillion? You can't just let it sit. So Japan buys US Treasury bonds, the safest dollar-denominated asset available. The money cycles back. Americans buy Japanese products, Japan buys American debt. China comes second with about $800 billion, down significantly from its peak of $1.3 trillion in 2013. The decline is deliberate. For years, China accumulated US debt the same way Japan did, through trade surpluses. But Chinese policymakers realized this gave America leverage. If China holds too much US debt, it can't sell without crashing its own holdings. It's a trap. So China has been slowly diversifying, buying less US debt and more European bonds, Asian infrastructure, African resources. The shift isn't just financial, it's geopolitical. Debt ownership is power, and China doesn't want its power denominated in dollars, controlled by Washington. Then come the curious entries: Luxembourg, Belgium, Ireland, the Cayman Islands. Tiny countries and territories holding hundreds of billions in US debt. Why? Because they're tax havens and financial centers where the real owners hide. When you see Cayman Islands holds $200 billion in US debt, what you're really seeing is hedge funds, private equity firms, and ultra-wealthy individuals using offshore structures to avoid scrutiny. The beneficial owners could be Russian oligarchs, Chinese billionaires moving money out of the country, American plutocrats avoiding taxes, or sovereign wealth funds that don't want their holdings publicly known. This opacity is deliberate. The global debt system functions partly in shadow. We know the official numbers, which countries hold how much, but we often don't know who ultimately owns those positions. Layers of corporate structures, trusts, foundations, and offshore entities obscure the trail. Debt ownership equals power, and power prefers to operate unseen. So when politicians say America is in debt to China, they're technically correct but deliberately misleading. China holds about 2% of total US debt. That's significant in absolute dollars, but it's a fraction of the whole. The real story is much stranger and more circular. Most of the debt America owes is owed to Americans. Or more precisely, to American institutions that benefit from collecting interest paid by American taxpayers. Here's how the circle actually works in practice. The Treasury Department needs to borrow $1 trillion. It issues bonds, promises to pay specific amounts at specific times with specific interest rates. Primary dealers, a small group of authorized banks, buy these bonds at auction. They use money they have or money they borrow from elsewhere. At this point, the government has raised $1 trillion, and the banks own $1 trillion in assets. Then the Federal Reserve enters. The Fed announces it will buy $500 billion of these bonds from the banks. But here's the crucial part. The Fed doesn't use money it already has. It creates new money to buy the bonds. The Fed simply increases the bank's reserve accounts by $500 billion. New money has appeared. The government now has spending power that didn't exist before. The banks have $500 billion in new reserves they can lend out, creating even more money through fractional reserve banking. American workers pay taxes. The government uses tax revenue to make interest payments on all these bonds, to the banks that still hold them, to the pension funds that bought them, to the Federal Reserve. Those interest payments flow into the accounts of institutions and wealthy individuals. Workers funded the interest through taxes. Capital owners collected it through bond returns. It's a transfer system running on automatic every single day, invisible to most people. The debt is real. The $38 trillion exists on balance sheets. But the creditor isn't some external force. It's the system itself, feeding on the labor of ordinary people to generate returns for capital owners. And this pattern isn't unique to America. It's replicated across the entire planet, with variations that make it even more extractive in some places. Japan lends to the US by buying treasury bonds with its export earnings. The US lends to Europe through the International Monetary Fund and direct investment. Europe lends to developing nations through the World Bank and European Development Banks. Developing nations lend back to advanced economies by parking their foreign exchange reserves in Western bonds. Every country holds someone else's IOU. Every promise is backed by another promise somewhere else in the chain. If any major player tried to cash out, if any country decided to stop playing, the whole system would destabilize. It's mutually assured economic destruction, the financial equivalent of nuclear deterrence. Everyone's holding everyone else hostage, and the only way it works is if nobody tries to escape. But there's an asymmetry in this mutual hostage situation. Rich countries hold developing country debt as investments they can profit from. Poor countries hold rich country debt as reserves they need for survival. When Argentina defaults, vulture funds sue and seize assets. When the US prints trillions, the dollar remains the global reserve currency, and the world absorbs it. The game is rigged from the start. Take Japan's situation. The country has national debt exceeding 250% of GDP, the highest ratio of any major economy in the world. By any traditional economic logic, Japan should be in crisis, facing spiraling interest costs and the imminent threat of default. But Japan borrows at interest rates near zero, sometimes negative, meaning investors effectively pay Japan for the privilege of lending it money. How is this possible? Because 90% of Japanese government debt is held by Japanese citizens, banks, pension funds, and insurance companies. More importantly, the debt is denominated in yen, which the Bank of Japan can print whenever it wants. Japan owes money to itself in a currency it controls. As long as Japanese institutions believe in the system, as long as they view government bonds as the safest place for their money, the numbers don't matter. The debt could be 500% of GDP, and the mechanism would function the same way. This reveals something crucial. For countries that control their own currency, the debt isn't really about the numbers. It's about confidence. Japan could theoretically owe infinite yen because it can create infinite yen. The only constraint is whether creating too much money causes inflation that destroys the currency's value. But if inflation stays low, if the economy keeps functioning, the debt can grow forever without crisis. Compare this to Greece, which shares the euro and cannot print its own currency. When Greece's debt became unsustainable, it couldn't devalue or inflate its way out. It was trapped. The difference between Japan and Greece isn't economic responsibility or fiscal discipline. It's monetary sovereignty. Japan owns its currency. Greece doesn't. And that difference determines everything. Europe reveals an even darker dimension of how debt becomes a weapon of political control. The Eurozone countries share a currency, but not a fiscal policy. This creates permanent structural imbalances. Germany runs trade surpluses, accumulating euros from southern European countries. Those euros flow back south as loans. Germany effectively lends to southern Europe through the European Central Bank and various bailout mechanisms. This creates a permanent debtor-creditor relationship within the Union. Northern Europe, led by Germany, sees itself as responsible and prudent, lending to spendthrift Southerners who need to learn fiscal discipline. Southern Europe sees itself under economic occupation, forced to cut social spending and accept unemployment to service debts to Northern creditors. Elections change governments, but the debt relationships remain. Democracy becomes constrained by bond markets. And here's where it gets truly insidious. The debt becomes the mechanism for imposing policy that could never pass through democratic process. Greece wanted to maintain its pension system and public sector. German creditors demanded cuts. The democratically elected Greek government had to choose, implement austerity or face expulsion from the euro, which would mean complete economic collapse. They chose austerity. The will of Greek voters became irrelevant. Bond markets and creditor demands overrode democracy. This pattern repeats globally. The IMF lends to developing countries in crisis, but the loans come with conditionalities, required policy changes, privatize state industries, cut social spending, reduce tariffs, deregulate industries. These policies benefit foreign investors and creditors. They often harm local populations. But countries in crisis have no choice. Accept the conditions or face complete financial collapse. Debt becomes a tool through which powerful countries and institutions control weaker ones, without firing a shot, without sending troops, without formal colonization. It's economic domination dressed as financial assistance. Then there are the sovereign wealth funds, massive pools of capital that wield power without accountability. Norway's government pension fund, built on North Sea oil wealth, holds over $1.5 trillion invested globally. It owns more than 1% of all publicly traded stocks in the world. When Norway's fund decides to buy or sell, markets move. That's the wealth of one small country translated into power over global capital markets. Singapore's funds, GIC and Temasek, manage hundreds of billions. The UAE's Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund, Qatar Investment Authority, Kuwait Investment Authority, China's sovereign funds collectively. These entities manage trillions and can reshape markets with their decisions. They're not neutral investors. They're instruments of state power operating through financial channels. When Saudi Arabia's fund buys a major stake in a technology company, that's not just investment. It's geopolitical positioning, and they answer to no one outside their own governments. Democratic accountability doesn't exist for sovereign wealth funds. They can buy strategic industries in foreign countries, influence corporate decisions, shape entire sectors. A fund controlled by an authoritarian regime can buy media companies, technology platforms, critical infrastructure. The debt and equity they hold gives them power over supposedly independent institutions. Beneath all of this lies a shadow world deliberately kept invisible. Hedge funds holding sovereign debt through complex derivative structures. Private equity firms with ownership chains running through dozens of jurisdictions. Anonymous wealth parked in the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, Ireland, Switzerland, Singapore. These structures exist specifically to hide who ultimately owns what. Behind the corporate veils could be oligarchs moving wealth out of Russia, Chinese Communist Party officials hiding money offshore, Middle Eastern royals diversifying away from oil, cartel leaders laundering drug money, corrupt politicians from dozens of countries, or simply ultra-wealthy individuals and families who prefer to exercise power without visibility. Debt ownership equals power without accountability. The ability to influence governments, shape markets, and extract wealth while remaining completely anonymous. Overseeing this entire circus are the credit rating agencies. Moody's, Standard & Poor's, Fitch. 3 private, for-profit corporations that determine the financial fate of nations. They assign ratings to government bonds, AAA, AA, BBB, and so on, down to junk status. These ratings determine what interest rate a country pays to borrow. A downgrade can trigger immediate crisis. When S&P downgraded US debt in 2011, it caused market panic. Even though the downgrade was arguably absurd, the US prints its own currency and can never involuntarily default. But perception matters more than reality. The rating agencies shape perception, and markets react. These agencies answer to no electorate, follow no democratic process, and profit from the system they're supposed to objectively assess. The 2008 crisis exposed their corruption completely. They gave AAA ratings the highest possible to mortgage-backed securities that turned out to be worthless. Why? Because the issuers paid them for ratings. The agencies had a direct financial incentive to give favorable ratings regardless of reality. Thousands of people lost their homes, millions lost jobs, the global economy nearly collapsed, and the rating agencies faced essentially no consequences. They're still the gatekeepers. They still determine which countries can borrow cheaply and which pay crushing rates. They still shape the fate of nations through decisions made in private by unelected analysts following methodologies designed to serve creditors, not citizens. But all of these players, the banks, the funds, the sovereign wealth vehicles, the rating agencies, are intermediaries. Behind them lies the real power in modern finance. The institutions that don't just hold debt but manufacture it from nothing. The central banks. Central banks don't manage debt. They create it. Every time the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank or the Bank of Japan decides to buy government bonds, they create new money to pay for them. Not by running printing presses, by making digital entries on balance sheets. Money appears where none existed before. The government's liability becomes the central bank's asset. New currency enters circulation, and the government now owes this freshly created money back to the central bank with interest. Here's the revelation that changes everything once you truly understand it. Every dollar in existence represents debt somewhere in the system. There is no such thing as debt-free money in the modern economy. Every coin in your pocket, every bill in your wallet, every digital dollar in your bank account has an invisible IOU attached to it. Money creation and debt creation are the same process. They are not two separate things that happen to be related. They are literally identical. Money, IS, debt. Debt, IS, money. When you hold a dollar bill, you're holding a Federal Reserve note. The word note is a polite term for debt instrument. It's a promise. What's it a promise of? Originally, it was a promise to exchange the note for gold. But that ended in 1971. Now it's a promise to accept it for taxes. That's the backing. The government will accept its own notes for tax payments. That's what gives them value. And those notes entered circulation through the government, borrowing them into existence. The Federal Reserve owns over $5 trillion in government bonds. It created that money out of nothing, not from reserves, not from deposits, but from the institutional authority to expand its balance sheet. The government borrowed money that didn't exist until the moment the loan was made. The Fed created it by buying bonds. And now the government owes it back with interest, paid by taxpayers, flowing back to the Fed, which then distributes most of its profits to member banks after keeping some for operations. This process used to be emergency policy, something done only in desperate times when conventional methods failed. Then came 2008. The financial crisis exposed the mechanism on an unprecedented scale. The Fed bought over $4 trillion in bonds and mortgage-backed securities through quantitative easing. The term sounds technical and boring, which is deliberate. What it actually means, the central bank created trillions of dollars to prevent the financial system from collapsing. No printing presses were involved, just computer keystrokes. A Fed official types numbers into a computer, and those numbers become legal tender that can purchase real assets. When the public expressed shock that this was possible, economists shrugged and said, "This is how it's always worked. We just never did it this openly before. We've always known money can be created from nothing. We just prefer not to talk about it too directly because it might undermine confidence." Then 2020 arrived, and 2008 looked quaint by comparison. COVID-19 triggered the largest money creation event in human history. Governments needed to spend trillions on pandemic response, direct payments to citizens, business support, healthcare costs, economic stimulus. Where would the money come from? Central banks created it. The Fed's balance sheet doubled in months, going from $4 trillion to over $8 trillion. The European Central Bank, Bank of Japan, Bank of England, Bank of Canada, Reserve Bank of Australia, all followed similar paths. Over $10 trillion in new money materialized globally in less than 2 years. The money supply expanded by amounts that would have been considered impossible or at least catastrophic just years earlier. And where did that money go? This is where the scam becomes nakedly obvious. The money didn't flow evenly through society. It couldn't. The mechanism doesn't work that way. Central banks create money by buying bonds and assets from financial institutions. So the money flows to the financial system first, to banks, to investment funds, to institutions that already own assets. Those institutions take the newly created money and do what they're designed to do: invest it for returns. They buy stocks, driving markets to record highs in the middle of a pandemic and economic crisis. They buy real estate, making housing unaffordable for millions. They buy bonds, cryptocurrencies, commodities, anything that might generate returns. Asset prices explode across the board. People who own assets, any assets, stocks, houses, bonds, see their wealth multiply. A homeowner who bought before the pandemic watches their home value increase 30%, 40%, 50% in 2 years. Someone with a stock portfolio sees it double. Bitcoin goes from $7,000 to $60,000. These aren't organic market movements. They're the direct result of massive money creation flowing into asset markets. Meanwhile, people who only have their labor, who live paycheck to paycheck with no investments, they eventually get hit with inflation on necessities. Food prices rise, rent increases, gas gets more expensive. Their wages might go up 3%, but their cost of living goes up 7%. The inflation everyone worried about did arrive, but it hit the people who benefited least from the initial money creation. This isn't an accident or an unfortunate side effect. This is the design. The money creation mechanism structurally benefits asset owners at the expense of wage earners. It has to. The central bank can't hand money directly to ordinary people, except in rare cases like stimulus checks, which are tiny compared to the asset purchases. It creates money by buying financial assets, which means financial asset owners benefit first and most. The wealth gap didn't just grow during the pandemic. It exploded. Billionaires added trillions to their wealth. The top 10% saw their assets appreciate dramatically. The bottom 50% saw the cost of living rise while their wages stagnated or disappeared entirely through unemployment. And everyone was told this was necessary to save the economy. Save it for whom? Japan has been running this experiment longer than anyone, and it shows the logical endpoint of the system. Since the 1,990 seconds following the collapse of their real estate and stock bubbles, the Bank of Japan has been buying government debt on an ever-expanding scale. The bank now owns over half of all Japanese government bonds in existence. The central bank owns the majority of the national debt. Think about what this means. The government owes money primarily to an institution it created and nominally controls. But it gets stranger. The Bank of Japan also buys stocks through exchange-traded funds. The central bank directly intervenes in equity markets to prop up prices. It's now one of the largest shareholders in the Japanese stock market. The boundary between government, central bank, and private markets has dissolved completely. They've merged into a single entity where the government borrows from itself, the central bank creates money to buy government debt and private stocks, and the distinction between public and private, between government and market, ceases to have any clear meaning. This is the endgame. Not a temporary emergency measure, but the new normal. Government, central bank, and financial markets merge into one system. And the people who understand how to navigate this system extract wealth while everyone else pays for it through inflation, stagnant wages, and unaffordable assets. Some economists have started arguing this is fine, that we should acknowledge reality and stop pretending otherwise. Modern monetary theory, or MMT, says sovereign nations that control their own currency can never go broke in a conventional sense. They can always create money to pay debts. The only real limit is inflation, not solvency. If creating too much money causes runaway price increases, That's a problem. But the threat of default? Impossible for a government that can print its own currency. MMT is controversial, but it increasingly describes reality, whether orthodox economists like it or not. Japan proved a country can carry debt exceeding 250% of GDP indefinitely without crisis. The United States created trillions during COVID without hyperinflation. The theoretical limits everyone cited for decades turned out to be wrong, or at least far more flexible than anyone admitted. But there's a crucial caveat that MMT advocates sometimes downplay. This only works as long as confidence holds, as long as people believe in the system, as long as investors trust that the currency will retain value, as long as the collective hallucination continues. The numbers can stretch indefinitely, but confidence is fragile. And when it breaks, the consequences are absolutely catastrophic. We've seen it happen. Over and over throughout history, we've watched what occurs when belief in a debt system evaporates. And it's never the creditors who suffer most. Greece in 2010 showed what happens when the confidence mechanism breaks down. The country had borrowed heavily during the boom years of the 2000s, running up debt to fund government operations, social programs, and preparations for the 2004 Olympics. Much of this borrowing happened at artificially low interest rates because Greece was part of the Eurozone, and investors assumed incorrectly that the European Union would never let a member state default. Then the 2008 financial crisis hit, revealing that Greece had been using accounting tricks to hide the true size of its deficit. Tax revenue collapsed as the economy contracted. Greece's budget deficit exploded from an official 3% of GDP to a real number closer to 15%. Suddenly, investors realized Greece couldn't print euros the way the US could print dollars or Japan could print yen. The European Central Bank controlled the currency, and it wasn't clear whether it would rescue Greece or let it fail as an example to others. Bond yields spiked. The interest rate Greece had to pay to borrow money shot up from 4% to over 30% in a matter of months. At those rates, servicing the debt became mathematically impossible. The government couldn't borrow new money to pay its bills, couldn't print its own currency, couldn't cut spending fast enough to balance the budget without triggering complete economic collapse. The entire system seized up. The European Central Bank and International Monetary Fund stepped in with a bailout package worth over 100 billion. But the rescue wasn't designed to save Greece. It was designed to save German, French, and other European banks that had lent to Greece and would have suffered catastrophic losses from a Greek default. The bailout money flowed through the Greek government and straight back out to creditors. Greek citizens got austerity. The conditions were brutal. Dramatic tax increases, slashing of government spending, cuts to pensions and public sector salaries, elimination of social programs, privatization of state assets at fire sale prices. Youth unemployment hit 60%. An entire generation of educated young Greeks saw their futures destroyed. Many emigrated, seeking opportunities elsewhere in Europe. The brain drain hollowed out the country's future. Greece's economy shrank by 25%. Over the course of the decade, a decline comparable to America's Great Depression. Suicide rates increased, poverty spiked, the social fabric tore apart. And throughout it all, the debt barely decreased. Because the austerity that was supposed to improve Greece's fiscal position actually made it worse. Cutting spending during a recession deepened the recession, which reduced tax revenue, which increased the deficit, which required more austerity. It was a death spiral. The suffering was socialized. Greek workers paid through lost jobs, reduced pensions, eliminated services. But the profits remained private. Banks and bondholders were mostly made whole. The lesson was clear. When debt systems break, the wealthy don't suffer. Workers do. Always. Argentina's story is even more devastating because it keeps repeating in an endless cycle of debt, default, crisis, restructuring, and then debt again. The country has defaulted on its sovereign debt 9 times since independence. 9 times. The most recent defaults came in 2001 and 2020, but the pattern goes back to the 1000 820 seconds. Each cycle follows the same script. Argentina borrows heavily during good times, often from foreign creditors offering easy money. The economy grows, governments spend freely, everyone believes this time will be different. Then an economic shock hits. Commodity price collapse, currency crisis, terms of trade deterioration, tax revenue falls. The debt becomes unsustainable. Argentina can't pay. Default leads to economic catastrophe. Currency collapses, inflation skyrockets, poverty spikes, the middle class sees savings evaporate overnight. Then come the vulture funds. These are hedge funds that specialize in buying distressed debt at deep discounts. They purchase Argentine bonds, trading at 20 or 30 cents on the dollar, from investors who want to cut their losses. Then they sue in international courts for full repayment at 100 cents on the dollar. Elliott Management, one of the most aggressive vulture funds, bought Argentine debt for $48 million after the 2001 default. Through years of litigation in New York courts, they eventually extracted $2.4 billion from Argentina, a return of over 600%. When Argentina refused to pay, Elliott seized an Argentine naval training vessel docked in Ghana. They grabbed Zambian copper revenues that were supposed to go to development projects. They hunted Argentine assets across the globe. This is legal. International courts enforce these judgments. The vulture funds frame it as defending creditor rights and the sanctity of contracts. But the practical effect is extracting billions from countries where ordinary citizens are starving, where hospitals lack medicine, where schools are crumbling. The funds profit from national suffering, and the international legal system enables it. Sri Lanka in 2022 demonstrated how quickly confidence can evaporate and how devastating the consequences can be when it does. The country had borrowed heavily for development projects throughout the 2010 seconds, particularly infrastructure built by Chinese firms and financed through Chinese loans at high interest rates. The government also cut taxes dramatically in 2019, reducing revenue just as debt service costs were rising. Then COVID-19 hit. Tourism, a major source of foreign currency, vanished overnight. Remittances from Sri Lankans working abroad declined. Export earnings fell. Without foreign currency, Sri Lanka couldn't pay for essential imports. Fuel ran out. Power plants shut down for lack of diesel. The country went dark, literally. Blackouts lasted hours every day. Food became scarce as agriculture collapsed without fuel for tractors and trucks. Inflation hit 50%. Medicine disappeared from hospitals. People died from treatable conditions because there were no supplies. The government ran out of paper to print money. They ran out of fuel for ambulances and fire trucks. The entire country ground to a halt. In July 2022, protesters stormed the presidential palace. The president fled the country on a military jet. The government collapsed. The IMF arrived with a $2.9 billion bailout package, carrying the usual conditions: austerity, privatization, cuts to subsidies and social spending, restructuring of state-owned enterprises. The creditors became suddenly, painfully visible. China held billions in debt from infrastructure projects. Japan held billions from decades of development assistance. The World Bank, Asian Development Bank, and private bondholders all demanded repayment. And the Sri Lankan people paid the price through unemployment, poverty, and the collapse of essential services. When the system works smoothly, debt is an abstraction. Numbers on screens, economic theory. But when it breaks, creditors appear as tangible forces with the power to reshape entire societies. And the restructuring never benefits the people. It benefits the bondholders. Even after these catastrophic collapses, the same logic restarts. New loans replace old ones, defaulted debts are restructured at partial value, but new borrowing begins almost immediately. The machine resets because there's no alternative within the current international system. Countries need foreign currency to trade globally. They need to borrow to bridge deficits. Creditors need somewhere to invest surplus capital. So the cycle continues. Crisis after crisis, bailout after bailout, each one proving the same lesson. When debt systems fail, the wealthy don't suffer. They profit. Workers pay. And here's why. These crises will keep happening. Why they're built into the system rather than being aberrations. Sovereign debt in the modern system isn't designed to be repaid. It's designed to be rolled over forever. When you or I borrow money for a car or a house, we're expected to pay it back. There's an amortization schedule. We make monthly payments that include both principal and interest. Eventually, years or decades later, the debt is retired. We own the asset, free and clear. The relationship ends. Governments don't work this way. They never have and never will under the current system. Governments treat debt like a subscription service, permanent, automatically renewing, never ending. When bonds mature, when the principal is technically due back to bondholders, governments don't pay it off with accumulated savings. They issue new bonds to pay the old ones. This process, refinancing or rolling over, is so standard, it's not even considered unusual. It's the normal, expected, default operation of sovereign debt. Think about what this means. The principal never matters. The actual amount owed is almost irrelevant in practical terms. What matters is the interest payment. The regular stream of money flowing from government treasuries to bondholders. Interest is the real product being sold. It's the rent creditor's charge for providing liquidity to the system, for maintaining confidence, for not demanding their money back all at once. And the global economy has become dependent on that rent the way a shark depends on constant movement. If it stops, everything dies. Here's why paying off the debt would actually destroy the modern economy rather than save it. Imagine if the United States government somehow decided tomorrow to eliminate its entire $38 trillion in debt, maybe through massive spending cuts or selling off assets or some combination of historically unprecedented policies. What would happen? Every pension fund, every bank, every insurance company, every sovereign wealth fund, every central bank in the world would suddenly lose their safest, most reliable asset. US Treasury bonds are considered the foundation of global finance. They're what economists call risk-free assets. Not because they're literally without risk, nothing is, but because they're as close as the financial world gets. Pension funds hold them to generate stable returns for future retirees. Banks use them as collateral for other transactions and to meet regulatory capital requirements. Central banks hold them as reserves backing their own currencies. Eliminating these bonds would remove the bedrock of modern finance. It would be like pulling the foundation out from under a building while people are living in it. Worse, paying off the debt would require removing $38 trillion from circulation. The government would have to somehow collect that money through taxes or asset sales, and then hand it to bondholders and retire the bonds. The money supply would shrink dramatically, potentially by a third or more. This would trigger severe deflation, not inflation. It's opposite. Deflation sounds good to people who only think about prices falling. But deflation is economically catastrophic. When prices fall consistently, people and businesses delay purchases, waiting for better deals tomorrow. Consumer spending drops. Business investment freezes. Economic activity contracts. Unemployment rises. And here's the kicker. As the money supply shrinks and deflation sets in, existing debts become more burdensome in real terms. A $300,000 mortgage becomes harder to pay when your income is falling and the currency is strengthening. This is why politicians who campaign on paying down the national debt or balancing the budget are either cynically lying or dangerously ignorant. The system cannot function without permanent government debt. The modern economy is built on it. The goal is never elimination. The goal is sustainability, keeping the debt growing slower than the economy, keeping it serviceable, and keeping it desirable to investors. Government bonds aren't viewed as liabilities by the people who own them. They're assets. Some of the most valuable, sought-after assets in existence. The system doesn't just tolerate permanent government debt. It requires it as a foundational element. Without government bonds, the entire architecture of modern finance collapses. So governments issue bonds continuously, rhythmically, predictably, not flooding the market and destroying value, but maintaining steady supply that keeps the system liquid and functional. Debt becomes the heartbeat of capitalism, the pulse that flows through every pension fund, every mortgage, every market on earth. Regular, predictable, essential. The political theater around fiscal responsibility and balancing the budget is exactly that theater performed for voters who don't understand how the system actually works. When politicians talk about eliminating the national debt or running surpluses, they're selling a comforting fantasy that plays well in campaigns, but has nothing to do with actual policy. The real goal, the thing governments and central banks actually try to achieve, is keeping debt sustainable relative to economic growth. As long as GDP increases faster than debt, as long as the economy grows enough to generate tax revenue that covers interest payments, the system can continue indefinitely. The nominal numbers, $38 trillion, $50 trillion, eventually $100 trillion, don't matter as long as the ratio between debt and GDP remains manageable, and as long as interest rates stay low enough that servicing the debt doesn't consume the entire budget. The plan was never to pay it back. The plan is to keep the world believing that it could be paid back if necessary, that the government is responsible and trustworthy, that the bonds will always be honored. It's a closed loop of trust. As long as that trust holds, as long as confidence remains intact, the actual size of the debt is almost irrelevant. The numbers can stretch toward infinity. But here's where the phrase, "we owe it to ourselves," transforms from misleading into actively malicious propaganda. The interest payments don't flow equally through society. They don't circulate harmlessly within we. They flow upward, systematically and structurally, from workers to capital owners, from the many to the few. Workers pay taxes, governments collect that tax revenue. A portion, an increasing portion in many countries, goes to servicing debt. Those interest payments flow to whoever owns the bonds: pension funds, banks, wealthy individuals, sovereign wealth funds, foreign governments. The top 10% of wealth holders own roughly 89% of all stocks and bonds in most developed countries. The bottom 50% own essentially nothing. They might have a small pension balance or 401, but their ownership stake in financial assets is negligible compared to the wealthy. When central banks create money to buy bonds, when asset prices inflate as a result, the wealthy benefit disproportionately because they own the assets that are appreciating. Their portfolios grow. Their net worth increases. Meanwhile, workers without significant assets see the cost of necessities rise: housing, food, education, healthcare, while their wages stagnate or grow more slowly than inflation. Debt isn't just a transfer of resources between countries, between present and future, between generations. It's a transfer between economic classes. It's a mechanism for moving wealth from labor to capital, from those who work for wages to those who own assets and collect rent. This is why global inequality and global debt have risen in perfect tandem over the past 4 decades. They're not separate phenomena that happen to correlate. They're two sides of the same mechanism. Debt is the tool. Inequality is the result. The system rewards those who own debt and punishes those who merely pay it. And it's not just governments playing this game. Corporations learned the same lesson and weaponized it. Apple sits on hundreds of billions in cash reserves, but carries tens of billions in debt. Why would a cash-rich company borrow? Because debt is more profitable than using their own money. They can borrow at 3% interest, use that money for stock buybacks or acquisitions or investments, generate returns of 7% or more, and pocket the difference. The interest payments are tax deductible, reducing their tax burden. Debt for corporations, just as for governments, isn't a burden to be eliminated. It's a profit-maximizing tool to be leveraged. Stock buybacks funded by debt have become one of the primary ways corporations enrich shareholders at the expense of workers and long-term investment. Instead of raising wages, or investing in research, or upgrading facilities, companies borrow money to buy back their own stock, artificially inflating share prices. Executives with stock-based compensation get richer. Shareholders see values increase. Workers get nothing, except the vague promise that a rising stock price somehow helps everyone. So, who owns the world's debt? Who are the creditors in this planetary system of IOUs? Wealthy individuals and institutions in every country, people whose names you don't know, but who collectively control trillions. Sovereign wealth funds managing oil revenues and trade surpluses. Pension funds, though the benefits flow primarily to those with large balances, retired executives and professionals rather than workers with modest retirement accounts. Central banks creating money to purchase debt and using those purchases to control economies and enrich member banks. Anonymous wealth hidden in offshore tax havens, shielded behind corporate structures designed to obscure ownership. And increasingly, the system itself, the circular network of institutions that create debt, buy it, sell it, trade it, and use it as foundation for everything else. At the top of this pyramid, there's no single villain to blame. It's not China, though China holds significant amounts. It's not Wall Street, though Wall Street profits enormously. It's not the IMF or World Bank, though they enforce the system's rules. It's all of them, interconnected and interdependent, forming a global network of creditors who benefit from the current arrangement. And it's supposedly us too, we're told. We're both debtors and creditors through our pension funds and retirement accounts, through our participation in the economy. The system deliberately blurs these lines until it becomes almost impossible to say where debtor ends and creditor begins. This confusion is strategic. It prevents collective understanding of how the system actually works and who actually benefits. But make no mistake, despite the deliberate confusion, the benefits flow overwhelmingly in one direction, upward, from workers to owners, from the indebted to the creditors, from the powerless to the powerful. Modern finance has transformed debt from a temporary relationship between specific parties into a permanent, structural feature of civilization. Governments issue it as the foundation of policy. Banks multiply it through fractional reserve lending, turning every dollar of reserves into $10 of loans. Investors trade it as a commodity. Central banks monetize it, creating new currency by purchasing it. And ordinary citizens depend on the entire system continuing to function because every job, every pension, every public service, every aspect of modern life relies on this debt-based architecture. Debt once meant bondage. In ancient Rome, debtors who couldn't pay could be enslaved, their bodies sold to satisfy creditors. In medieval Europe, unpaid debt meant prison, sometimes for life. It was shameful, dangerous, something to be avoided or quickly repaid before it destroyed you. Debt relationships were supposed to be temporary. You borrowed, you repaid. The obligation ended. Today, debt means balance, stability, the foundation of economic order. What changed wasn't human nature or ethics or morality. What changed was the permanence. Ancient debt was designed to be temporary. Modern debt is designed to exist forever. The perpetual obligation replaced the temporary one. And that shift from temporary to permanent is what transformed debt from a tool of occasional necessity into the central organizing principle of the global economy. But permanence creates profound fragility. The system survives only through sustained confidence. If that balance ever tips, if belief wavers, if trust evaporates even slightly, the illusion can shatter with terrifying speed. And we'll remember what debt really is beneath the sophisticated financial engineering. A promise that can't be kept forever. A mechanism for extracting wealth from the many to benefit the few. A power structure masquerading as economic necessity. The system has survived for decades through wars, financial crises, recessions, pandemics, on nothing but confidence. But confidence isn't infinite. History teaches this lesson repeatedly, though we somehow always think our era is different. Every empire that believed itself permanent eventually fell. Every currency that seemed eternal eventually collapsed. Every financial system that appeared unshakable eventually broke. The Roman denarius went from pure silver to worthless plated copper, as emperors debased it to pay debts. The Spanish Empire bankrupted itself repeatedly, defaulting on debt even while silver flowed in from the Americas. The British pound lost its status as global reserve currency, replaced by the dollar. And someday, not if, but when, the current system will give way to whatever comes next. Our system is no different from those that came before. We're not magically exempt from historical patterns just because we have computers and complex financial instruments. The question isn't whether the current debt-based system will eventually transform or collapse. The question is when and what replaces it, and who pays the price when transformation comes. Because here's the final truth about debt ownership. It's power. Not abstract theoretical power, but concrete, tangible power over governments, over corporations, over individuals and their daily lives. Those who own the debt own the future in a very literal sense. They decide which nations can afford to govern themselves according to democratic will and which must submit to austerity dictated by bond markets. They determine which currencies survive and which collapse. They shape which economies thrive and which are systematically bled dry through interest payments and structural adjustment. Democracy may choose political leaders, may determine which party controls government, may decide surface-level policy questions. But creditors choose economic destiny. They set the actual constraints within which democratic governments must operate. A country can elect whatever government it wants. But if bond markets don't approve, if creditors lose confidence, the elected government's options shrink to nothing. Implement austerity or face economic collapse. Those are the choices. Democracy becomes theater, while creditors wield the real power. Understanding who owns the world's debt means understanding who owns the world, who holds actual power in the modern global system. And the answer isn't comforting for anyone who believes in democratic governance or national sovereignty or economic self-determination. It's a network of institutions and individuals whose names most people don't know, operating through mechanisms most people don't understand, exercising power that democracy never granted them and that voters cannot revoke. The visible government, the elected officials, the parliaments, the public debates is increasingly a shell, a democratic facade over a system where the real decisions about money supply, interest rates, which countries survive crises and which are restructured and dismantled, are made by creditors operating in the shadows of international finance. The system rewards those who own debt and punishes those who merely pay it. That's not a bug. That's not an unfortunate side effect that could be reformed. That's the core design. That's what the system is for. And as long as debt remains the foundation of modern money, as long as every dollar represents an IOU somewhere in the chain, as long as governments issue bonds they never intend to repay, the extraction will continue. If this changed how you see the global economy, if you understand now that the debt system isn't neutral but actively designed to benefit specific interests at the expense of everyone else, hit subscribe. Because history has the answers to the questions that actually matter. And I'll show you exactly where to look. Understanding who owns the debt isn't just an academic exercise. It's the key to understanding who owns power in the modern world. And that's a question that should concern all of us.